On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with my friend Jessica Beijing. I met Jessica a number of years now, probably a decade or more ago, when we were working together at the Amazonian Ayahuasca Shipibo Center, the Temple of the Way of Light. We've known each other for a long time. I think Jessica has a beautiful presence, a beautiful, deep experiential knowledge. She spent many years working with within the Shipibo tradition, specifically with a family of Shipibo Ainanya, or healers, curanderos, Ines, Laura, Lila, that family. We spoke about her background, about work with ayahuasca, about dieta, about spirituality, about Santo Daime, master plans, visions of the future, mutual teacher of ours, Emika. It was a really, I think, deep conversation. I think she has a lot of wisdom to share, and I trust you all will get a lot out of this episode. As always, if you're interested in working with myself, you can check out my website, which is nicotianarustica.org. If you're interested in integration work, consultation work, and working in Dieta, we have a number of retreats coming up, and we have our schedule, our calendar, all up on the website. And then finally, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help. Patreon is an amazing option. It's a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, thank you so much to the patrons, the people supporting that way. It really allows me to continue making these episodes. And if you're able to, thank you so much in advance. And then finally, if you're able to help with the algorithms, it's always a really big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the videos, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So I think that's it for the intro, and without further ado, here is my conversation with Jessica.
Running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Thank you for coming on. I think we were actually talking for about a half an hour before we started recording. But we've known each other for a long time. I remember still very well the first time I saw you. It was on a boat coming in from I think Santa Clara at that time. And you have a beautiful energy. We become close over the years. We worked for many years at a very large ayahuasca healing center called the Temple of the Way of Light. I've had a number of people on from there. Even Marta, who we were talking before, was just on the podcast. It was a really unique, beautiful, maybe challenging at times, but just I think really special environment to be immersed in a place where we were working so closely with a group of people, the Shipibo people. I think very much experts in plant medicine, working with so many foreigners coming down to experience that tradition, mainly ayahuasca. Although, as we'll talk about, maybe more than ayahuasca too. Ayahuasca is usually the gateway that attracts people. But I would imagine a number of people listening to this who are familiar with the podcast know you, know of you, maybe they've listened to you, do some interviews for Niwa Shobo. But for those who do know you, for those who don't know you, and I know this is always a big question, but can you just speak a bit about yourself, who you are, where you come from, and just kind of the journey? And you've had a really amazing life, a really fascinating life that's led you to this point you are now, sitting, having this conversation.
Yeah, firstly, thank you for the invitation. And that period that we worked together at the temple, I think for many people who were around at that time, was this very formative experience that catalyzed a lot of the direction my life has taken. And a lot of those relationships that were created at that time still feel really strong, even if we don't talk or see each other that often. There was something that was forged in the fires of challenge and transformation and togetherness that is very unique, that I value. And talking about myself is not always my favorite thing to do, but I'll see. I'll see what I can come up with. I was born in Canada, in a very tiny Midwestern kind of town. And I grew up in a city called Winnipeg, Manitoba. And it seems like a very, very uncommon thing for a person growing up in that environment to take the trajectory that I took, because there was no examples in my life of somebody living a life like that. And so that's where the mystery comes in, I think. Like, how did I end up walking this uncommon path and having the spirit of adventure to go to these very distant lands? And a big part of it, I feel, is growing up feeling like an oddball, like an outsider, like somebody that didn't fit in, like somebody that was an alien within the environment of my, peers and my family and my community. And that forcing me at some point to have a longing to search for somewhere where I might belong, or for people that might feel like my people. And so I started traveling very young. I left home at 18 and I went to Southeast Asia. And that ignited this passion for seeing other ways of being and other ways of living and other ways of relating to one another. And so from an early age, I was really attracted to practices and environments that felt alive to me. It felt like this living spirit that we are as humans hasn't been lost, hasn't been obscured by skepticism and rationality and all of the ways in which we're socialized to believe and think what's possible. And so that spirit of curiosity brought me into contact with different things that lit me up. And one of those things was capoeira, which is a Brazilian martial art. And although the way it's taught in the world is a more or less a secular way of teaching, within that art form, there are deep spiritual roots from Africa, from the Orishas, the spirits of nature. And I think that I could feel that. And I think that that's what really attracted me to it. This art form, which was a teaching in and of itself, like anything that I've ever been attracted to holds all of these teachings that are not necessarily coming from the mind, or they're not conceptual teachings. They're coming from the body and awakening the instinct of the body and how the body is in relationship to other bodies, the body of the world. And so this passion for capoeira brought me to Brazil. And when I was in Brazil, I I was invited to an ayahuasca ceremony. And when I first drank ayahuasca, I had started hearing about it because I was somebody that traveled and kind of wandered in these alternative circles. It wasn't at that time, in my early 20s, it wasn't something that was really well known about in the above ground world. But within the environments that I walked, I would meet people every once in a while. And I had started to hear about this medicine that was a plant substance that was this wise teacher, and people talked about it having a feminine spirit. And I think that idea really attracted me because I had already come to observe that human teachers were subject to human frailties and human ego. And so having a teacher that came from nature felt like a lot safer to me, that nature couldn't be corrupted by the false ideas that most humans are. Even if we've done a lot of work and we've followed a very disciplined, rigorous path to purification and liberation, there's still a lot of programming in there that we don't always see from our different blind spots. And even the wisest teachers, in my experience, are sometimes subject to these human frailties. And so when I drank medicine for the first time, the experience that I had was kind of like this realization, that hit me like a blast of energy or a blast of remembrance. And it was a remembrance. And the thought that came into my head was, oh, I'm a beloved child of God. I forgot. And then I was laughing at myself. I was like, how could I ever forget something so fundamental and essential to who I was? Because in the space of that connection with the medicine, it was really obvious. It was really obvious that I was a child of all that is, and that every single part of this world, what was part of the world, belonging, essential, beloved to the whole. And so it just seemed like, how silly, like how could I forget that? That's who I am, that's who we all are. And what could life be like if I lived from that knowing? And what could life be like if we all lived from that knowing that life is sacred, that my life is sacred, that all life is sacred? And so then I kind of got a sense in that moment that the spirit of this medicine had a potential for humanity, individually and collectively. And that perhaps there was like a mission there. That was my feeling of like, oh, this medicine has come to put order or to restore the primordial order, the primordial design, the primordial coherence that has been obscured and distorted and lost through all of the things that we already know about. And so in that moment, I said to the medicine in a very innocently fierce way, sign me up for the mission. I want to be part of this mission. Show me where to go. Take me to the people that can guide me. And I really didn't know what I was signing up for in that moment. And if I would have known everything that I've had to face since that time, I don't know what I would have had to face if I didn't make that commitment. But it seemed like there's been a certain accelerating, intensifying force that comes along with working with plant medicine, that involves like a pressurization which polishes the crystal that we are. And so, yeah, that I think was the beginning of my decision to walk this as a path. And then every step along the way, it has been about choosing to walk it. And of course, along the way, there's been a lot of moments of doubt and a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities to refresh the commitment and to renew the commitment in new and different ways. So when I first came to the temple, it was in a period of my life where I was in a bit of a transition. I had left Brazil. In Brazil, I had had people that I considered my teachers or lineages that I was in connection with. And when I left, I felt a bit like a spiritual orphan. I didn't know where my community was, my spiritual community, my medicine community, and I was longing for that, and I was longing for a teacher. And I recognized in that moment that I had been ingesting a lot of plants and that there was this temporary sense of, expansion and opening and healing, but there didn't seem to be a lot of long-term change. And I was getting to a point where I was getting into some textures of inner work that I didn't have the tools to deal with on my own. Nobody had taught me about how to be with those parts of myself. So it was getting a bit confusing. And so I asked the medicine, I asked the medicine to bring me to an environment and to bring me to a teacher where I could learn in a way that was sustainable for me. And so very shortly after that, our mutual friend, Jen, who I met at a rainbow gathering, like when I was 22. And it was somehow we got in touch and we realized we were going to be in San Francisco and the same night, and we visited. And then she just offhandedly said, "Oh, we're missing a yoga teacher at the temple. Do you want to come teach yoga?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that sounds cool," but didn't really take it seriously. And then I slept on it and I was like, wow, this might be the answer to my prayer. This might be the environment that I was looking for. And yeah, and so it all felt very synchronistic. And in general, on this path, there has been a sense for me of being guided by unseen forces, or maybe they're starting to be seen a little bit, but an intelligence which is much, much greater than me. There's probably a lot more I could tell you about that, but that's a good start.
That was an amazing bio. I think just off of that, we could easily have a 3-hour conversation. What were those early Brazilian experiences like for you? The capoeira. Maybe if you could talk more about that. I mean, I think often people look at these things as very disparate paths. It's interesting you even mentioned this kind of, maybe for lack of better terms, more Western way of looking at things. It's a gift in many ways. We tend to reduce and label and sort and organize. But we often look at these things as very different, like capoeira is maybe a martial art or a song or a dance, but maybe not so much spirituality, although, as you said, there's a very deep spirituality to it. Ayahuasca work is something different. And just Brazil itself is such a fascinating place because it does bring together, I think, something very unique in the world. These three very strong worldviews, the Portuguese, the European roots, the African roots, the indigenous Amerindian roots. Can you speak a bit more about that? But, I think also with ayahuasca work now, just in general, for various reasons, it's these maybe Peruvian, Amazonian traditions have gained a lot more traction. But in Brazil, like it's a very alive tradition. I mean, it's very, very rooted in the culture, and it's something that's been worked with for a long, long time.
Yeah, Brazil was a very interesting place to be introduced to the medicine. And precisely for that reason, because more than anywhere else I've ever been, there's this mixing of different lineages that's happened there, and that it's been going on for a long enough time that new lineages that have a certain level of rootedness are evolving. And so, for example, although I'm not somebody who's studied Santo Daime in a very deep way, the first experiences I had were with churches that were kind of offshoots from Santo Daime. And Santo Daime, I believe, in Brazil is at least over 100 years old. I could probably check that information, but the history as it was told to me of Santo Daime was of this African Brazilian man, descendant of enslaved Africans, that was working as a rubber tapper in the jungle. And at some point he made contact with indigenous Amazonian Brazilians and was introduced to the medicine. And it sounds like, from what I could gather from the stories, that he was given some kind of dieta, that he was told to go in the jungle and only consume yucca for a certain number of days. And then once he completed that, he had a vision of a beautiful woman that he attributed, because he was a Christian man, or he attributed this vision to the Virgin Mary, and he was given a body of songs that formed the doctrine of the Santo Daime. And so these songs are drawing a lot from, Christian iconography and figures and Christ and Mary, but they're also drawing from nature, and they're also weaving some of the African influences of the Orishas that he was naturally connected to into this very, very beautiful and simple message. And the powerful thing I find about that origin story, how that began in Brazil, is that it came from a man who, he was a working class man. He was a descendant of enslaved ancestors, so, and then this whole massive movement that became a worldwide movement, and religion evolved from that. And in the beginning, it was something that was offered as like a community, as like a church. People came together and they did these works, these services, and they prayed together, and there was no hierarchy. There was no master or teacher. Everybody wore a uniform to denote the equality, that everybody in that environment was equal. And of course, those with more experience took on a bit more roles of responsibility. And there came to be like a very advanced structure to uphold this. And so that story fascinates me. It really fascinates me to see how the medicine, the spirit of the medicine, in connection with other thought, another way of thinking, another way of being, blossomed and grew and evolved into something completely new, but that was like an amalgam of all of these different influences. And I think that's been true in general. Like the little that I know about it, as different Amazonian indigenous nations contacted each other, introduced each other to the medicine, different nations took it into their way of being, and it evolved and it developed its new forms and colors and songs and designs, and then branched off this way. And then today, because there's a lot more globalization and these big encounters and meetings. It's like branching together and very much growing and evolving like a plant does, like a root structure does, but also as plants grow up and the trees and the branches grow into each other and the vines intertwine. It's like that's what how the medicine is moving amongst us as humans. So when I first arrived to Brazil and I was introduced to this kind of off branching of the Santo Daime, and the Santo Daime had already formalized itself and in some ways become quite strict and rigid within its protocols, preserving a certain integrity of the way that its form had come into being. And then the off branches were those who felt like they needed to explore like a new way that was coming through them in a sense. And so I remember this one church that I would frequent in Rio de Janeiro that was a mix of different lineages and so in Brazil, not only do you have the Santo Daime, you have União de Vegetal, which is like another similar church that had like a slightly different origin and development. You have Barquinha, which is actually much more African-based, and it has this iconography of like the sailors and being in a boat, and their uniform is kind of like a sailor. Then you have Umbandaime, which is drawing a lot from the Orishas and the incorporation of the spirits of the Orishas. And so this church was like combining all of those, and like we celebrate them all. And then they also would have a period of a meditation, and they would work with mantras from India, and then they would have a psychological discourse that was like the mestre, or the leader of this church, was a psychologist, and he had studied Freud and Jung and things like that. So they were just like basically mixing everything. And that, from where I stand now, having followed a very purist Shipibo lineage, that seems like insanity to me. But there was a lot of beauty, and there was a lot of fertility in that space. Yeah.
And just to clarify, when maybe for the audience, when you use the word medicine, you're referring to daime or ayahuasca, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How I know this may be hard to describe, but can you recall what in Capoeira like gave you a sense that there was something spiritual to it? Because I probably, as a lot of the audience knows, I practice martial arts, and I very much feel that. And I think some people feel it, some people don't, or maybe they consciously do, maybe they unconsciously also do. But I think even when you look at the roots of these things, they were spiritual practices. I mean, even if you trace them back to China or India, where maybe they formed, I mean, they were very synonymous with spiritual practices. Usually the monks or the religious class that were practicing those. Was there something particular? I mean, even the music of Capoeira, like having, not extensively, but done some work with Iboga. I mean, there's something similar in this resonance, this cadence, this rhythm that I think does transport you to a certain place if you can go, if you can flow with that, if you can kind of go into that.
Mm-hmm. So very much by chance, I remember the first time I saw capoeira being practiced as a teenager at a music festival, and I saw it and I was just like, oh, like, what is that? I want to do that, having really no idea what it was, but feeling something light up inside me really strongly. And then when I went to university in Montreal, I found out that my university gym had capoeira classes. And by chance, the classes that were happening there were a stream of capoeira called capoeira Angola. There's two main branches, capoeira regional and capoeira Angola. And capoeira Angola is generally more focused on the African roots, which include the African spiritual roots of Capoeira. And Angola was, a port in Portugal where the enslaved people from Africa were shipped off to the Americas. And so Angola, within Capoeira, it came to denote a homeland, but also like a spiritual homeland, like this land from which I'm from that I cannot return to, that holds this piece of, that's who I am. So within Capoeira Angola, it is part of what, if you have a good teacher, it's part of what they're transmitting the history of how that art and science was brought from Africa through these people that had been enslaved, and was part of a cultural resistance, and was part of this aliveness, this understanding of ourselves as unlimited life force in movement. That's what a martial art can teach us about being in a body. And so if you are, a person that has been enslaved, an art form that ignites that resilient, like eternal flame of unbroken spirit that you are, is a really, really powerful tool to have. So I can really understand, well, to my limited capacity, I can appreciate, what that really meant for those people. And it's my understanding that in the early days of Capoeira, the spirituality of Capoeira was like an intrinsic part of what was happening, because the rhythms that are being played are directly connected to the religious and spiritual root of that practice. And so the mestres, the people, the teachers that were holding these groups, they were deeply embedded in tejeros. The tejeros are like the temples where this form of spirituality was still practiced, with the rhythms and the dances and the connecting to those orishas, to the spirits, and in connecting to them, giving over my body as a vessel for that energy, and a lot of times that energy has a healing and ordering force. And so that spills over a little bit into, or a lot, into Capoeira. But that form of spirituality, it's also in some way something that you get initiated into. It's not, especially given the historical realities of Capoeira and the people that developed it and adapted it from different streams of African practices from the homeland. That sacred spiritual root wasn't something that you just shared with anybody. That's something that you need to get initiated into. And so when Capoeira as a practice became sort of introduced into, when for example, Capoeira regional was like a mestre bimba that decided to kind of standardize Capoeira into a certain set of movements and bring it into these academies and teach it to like more affluent white Brazilians. And so he separated the spiritual aspect out of it and brought this more secular version to the masses. And then the capoeira Angola, there's less separation, but it's still something that's not super actively spoken about. And I remember when I was very, very new to the practice of capoeira, and I was researching a lot, and I was reading, and I understand to some degree, and I felt the spirit, wake up in me, and I felt something, that spoke to me, that spoke to my own spirit. And then the first time I went to a conference where there was these Brazilian mestres, these people who had dedicated their whole lives, there were also practitioners of, that spirituality. And then I remember having a roda that was like going all night long. And then we get into this rhythmic, trance-like energy. And I remember like somewhere at 3 a.m. start to feel like, what is happening? There's this whole other energy that I don't understand here. And they were filming the rodas, and the roda is this circle where the capoeira practice is taking place. And there's a whole bateria of instruments where people are playing the songs and everybody's singing together. It's a call and response. It's a very, it's a technology of becoming one coherent body, of many bodies becoming one coherent body, and directing this and centralizing and focalizing this energy. And then the players, through this energy of presence and connection and listening and feeling from the body, magnified by the presence and attention of the circle around them and the rhythm, there's a science there. There's a spiritual science which is very, very advanced and which might not be immediately apparent. So I remember at one point the mestre just like turning off all of the cameras. And then it was this kind of signal of like, okay, we're in the territory of the sacred now. This is not something for, this is where we're inviting the ineffable into play. And then, after that, the game just took off to the next level. So I remember asking about that. I remember saying to the mestres, look, what happened there? What was that energy? And they were like, you want to know about that? Come to the Tejero. But, I'm not going to talk about it here. You want to know about more? You're curious? Okay, come. So then I started to understand, that this is like most sacred knowledge, there needs to be a level of protection around it, especially when it has been persecuted and oppressed and, made illegal. A lot of the streams of sacred knowledge and spiritual practice, which give us an embodied sense of our unlimited capacity, as life force in movement, have been suppressed, have been systematically shut down. Because what would happen if all of humanity became in touch with the power that we are? Well, the powers that be that try to keep everything in check, they wouldn't really stand a chance.
You mentioned in the beginning that I think you said something about this idea that your medicine was not so much coming from this rational or mind place, but this more embodied or somatic approach. I think that would resonate with a lot of people, but I think a lot of people, that's also a very foreign concept. I mean, usually when we think of just very broadly spirituality, we think of books or things you say or believe in. I think that idea of a very physical practice, an embodied practice, something that involves the body, is kind of a foreign concept. I mean, even in many spiritual traditions, there's often this idea of this kind of aesthetic idea of disregarding the body, that the body is almost like a hindrance to deeper knowledge. How do you view that more somatic approach of not only incorporating the body, but actually using the body as a gateway to spirit?
For me, for whatever reason, that's always been kind of like a given. Like there's no other portal. There's no other portal but through the body. And I'm not sure why exactly, but that seems to be what I've been attracted to and what I've been guided from. But as you were talking, before we started the call, we mentioned our mutual friend, Imika Taridu, a Tubu elder from the Tubu Nation, which in Colombia, kind of on the borders of Venezuela and Brazil. And as you were sharing, I remember when I first heard him say that according to the Tubu, dance is the highest expression of human wisdom. And I remember like feeling lit up by that, but not really knowing what it meant. And as I got to spend a little bit more time with Imika, I understood that the way that they do dances, it's like a collective practice that is used to reorder and reharmonize the community. So when you are in a circle with your community members, the imbalances that are there will become apparent through the mirror of that practice. Maybe somebody is like crowding the space of somebody else. Somebody's not walking in tune. Maybe the circle is a little wonky and on this side it's like really big and on this side it's really small. And then as you step together, chant together rhythmically, becoming attuned to how I position myself in relation to the whole, there's this natural ordering and natural harmonizing that comes through. And then the idea of being in harmony with myself and with others and with the container of the society is not a mental idea. It's something that I've lived physically in my body. And so in Imika's way, these healing technologies have a lot to do with that, have a lot to do with embodied practices that are done as a collective.
There was an interesting story. It was a number of years ago, but I think our mutual friend Claude, who's also done a lot of work with Imika, but I think someone asked him something, or maybe, I can't remember exactly, but it was around this idea of like an ingredient in hape or ambiol. I can't remember exactly now. But he said what it was, but he also said, instead of just learning what the ingredient is, which again is more of this kind of rational place of the mind, to actually go and find someone and learn the story, learn the dance. And I think that's a very, very powerful thing. It's interesting because even when I was introduced to Amika, both of us, we had been living and working with the Shipibo. And so I think this idea, as he would say, that every song has a story, every song has a song, every plant has a story, every plant has a song, every plant has a dance. Even that idea of the song was not a foreign concept to me at that time, because that was something I think we were very immersed in. But also this idea of the story of the dance and this idea of the reverence that any and every time you work with a plant to acknowledge the story, to remember the story, that there is an embodied presence. And he often speaks of these ideas of these códigos de sanación, these healing codes that are embedded in the stories, embedded in the songs, embedded in the dance. I think even people coming from maybe a Shipibo lineage can understand that idea of these healing codes that can be embedded in song. I think for so many people that's a very foreign concept. I mean, maybe even it can resonate on some level, like, okay, a plant has a song or a plant has a dance, but I want to ingest the plant, or I just want to work with the plant, or what is, and this is maybe a very big and kind of vague question, but what has been that experience for you of actually beginning to not only learn the stories, the songs, the dances, but that idea of embodiment, like how has that changed the practice? Even just to maybe some context. I mean, there's a beautiful quote by, I think he was a maybe 17th century Swiss physician. His name was Paracelsus, and he's often considered one of the fathers of Western medicine. And he has this beautiful and very profound quote, which is that the difference between poison and medicine is in the dose. And I think there's something very, very true about that. But as you were saying, there's even something about that that's very rational, and it also removes the context of the story or the tradition or the song or the dance, and that those are also layers of medicine. So, how have you, in your life, how have you seen those as also parts of medicine? Because usually when we think of medicine, we think of the substance, like the substance that we ingest, devoid of any outside context.
Mhm. Well, that's something that it's part of what I try to explain to people within my role as an educator, as a bridge to Shipibo tradition specifically. That in the beginning, it's hard to wrap one's mind around that possibility that that the energy, that the spirit of a medicine, of a plant, can be accessed not only through ingesting it, but by singing its song or by hearing its story. And as we both know, a big common misconception is that it's necessary to drink ayahuasca to have received the healing effects. If you're in a ceremony, you need to ingest this medicine, and that's where the healing comes from. But the way that the Shipibo understand it is the medicine of ayahuasca for them is primarily just opening up their vision, so to help them to see. But the work is actually being done by the spirits of all of these other plants the way that they access and transmit and bring those plant doctors into the spaces through their songs. And so traditionally, it wasn't necessary for a patient to drink medicine. They could just receive the transmission of the songs and the energy of the spirits of those plants that they considered to be doctor plants would be working on the person through the vessel of the maestro, and their ability to channel that energy and to be conscious and aware, like through the partnership of the maestro and the plants that they have dieted, that have become their allies, and the songs that they've received from those plants. So until you've actually experienced that, it's hard to understand it. We can somewhat understand it, but the more that you experience it, or if you're able to experience receiving an Icaro without being on the medicine and experiencing that physiological felt sense transformation in the body that happens as a result of that Icaro, it starts to become something more like, okay, I've lived that. I can understand it from my body's experience of having felt crappy in my body before, and now I feel better. I feel relief. So that's something that comes, I think, just through having the opportunity and time to experience. And then, I remember the Shipibo also have a lot of stories of origin, and a lot of those stories they consider to be sacred and kind of private and not something that they want to share very openly. And that was hard for me to understand in the beginning because it felt like, oh, but if you share these stories with us, it's going to help us understand and have a greater respect and reverence for the medicine. And in one of the retreats that I was facilitating with the maestras, I had talked to them about that. It would like, be really great if you want to share some of your stories, some of the cosmology, and bring, more. And initially they had said yes. And then we got to the day that was on the schedule. And I was like, okay, it's time to do the storytelling. And they're like, no. And I said, what do you mean? And they're like, no, that story has a spirit. If we want to tell that story, we have to fast and we have to give an offering. We can't just tell it to people that we don't know. And, at that point, as an organizer that had promised a certain experience to these paying customers, from a very Western perspective, I was like, oh, what do I do, And then I was like, well, what if we all do a fast and we all make an offering? And I kind of I was negotiating, I don't know if this is the correct thing that I should have been doing. But anyway, I was trying to see how we could find a happy balance. And then finally they're like, okay, fine. We're going to, we are going to talk until we can, and then we're going to stop when we can't. I was like, okay, great. Share whatever you want, And then we sat down, and I had brought, this was in Costa Rica, and I had brought some baby ayahuasca plants and chacruna, and we planted them on this land, and we made offerings, and, we tried to bring a sense of sacredness. And I explained to the people that this was a very important moment, and it was a rare thing to have a lot of respect, that this story contained a spirit, a spirit of the medicine. And then they started to tell the story. And as they started to tell the story, they started to get lit up, and everybody in the room got lit up. And I felt the spirit of that story, and I felt what a gift it was that it was being transmitted to us. And I'm not sure if it was the culturally correct thing to do, maybe from me, from in that moment of my life, kind of from this ignorance or from this Western perspective. I don't know if I would have done the same thing now, I probably wouldn't okay, respect, it's not the time. But in that moment, that's what I did. And so now, a lot of the time I see people coming to do retreats and they have a lot of questions. They come with this very questioning, they want to know everything. Tell me this, tell me that, tell me that. And it's sort of this quality of wanting to consume knowledge, but if there's no foundation of relationship to the spirit that is the abode of that wisdom and that knowledge, it's kind of like blowing air, or it's kind of I don't know if it's a disrespect, but it's a misuse of a power through ignorance, through not understanding what this really is. Because we've been taught to believe that stories are like mythologies, and they're nice, they're things we listen to, but we don't give a lot of importance to them. But within those stories, there is spirit, there is teaching, there is guidance, there is morals. These stories handed down orally from generation to generation. And within that story, as you mentioned, there is a teaching, there is a moral, there is a spirit, and there is a living, healing code. There's a way that story, just like an Icaro, just like a prayer, just like a song, awakens something inside that is part of the mystery that we can't fully understand. And what I really, talking about Inika, when I saw that the way that he heals is by telling the story of origin to a medicine or to the chicha or some kind of vessel that receives that imprint, just like the maestros sing their Icaro into a bottle of agua florida or perfume, charging that medicine into a liquid carrier, just by telling the story to this carrier and then delivering it to the person, those healing codes are awakened through that alchemical ingestion that has also to do with the physical digestion of our organs, of receiving the physical nourishment and then the spiritual nourishment that's been charged into that. So the more I think about it, the more I start to understand it. I'm like, this kind of medicine is so far beyond, so much more advanced, so much more holistic than what we tend to understand as medicine and healing from a Western perspective.
You spoke of something really beautiful in the Santo Daime tradition of how, from some people's view, it had become maybe stagnant or traditional, and I'm sure from their perspective, for the good of like maintaining the authenticity, the purity of the origin. But that how the school you attended was more of a living school. It was evolving. It was willing to maybe change or to grow, to evolve. I think often there's this interesting dichotomy or paradox is there's a lot of people who are not drawn to tradition at all. That there's very little interest, and whether that's good or bad is maybe someone else's decision. But then there are people who are very drawn to tradition. But there's also this interesting thing where we look at tradition as something static, that it is what it is, and that it's not changing, it's not evolving, it's not growing. And often I think when we speak of like something like the Shipibo tradition, that there's often this view that it is something static, like it is what it is. What has been your experience of because you also mentioned this idea of like, now you've been studying with the Shipibo tradition, and it's very focused. It has a particular maybe cosmovision, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but that it's not an amalgamation of a lot of things, of influences of a lot of outside things and mantras and different things, but it's Shipibo. There's something very still maybe pure about it. What has been your experience of kind of that dichotomy of something that is by name a tradition, but also how you've maybe seen that as a living tradition?
Mm-hmm. It's a very important topic, I think, for us to look into, because from what I've seen and from what I've experienced, tradition is constantly in evolution. And yet, there's ways in which perhaps that as an idea can contribute to people without enough of experience mixing things together in a way that doesn't work, because they're like, oh, they think they know better, So I think part of being part of a tradition or following a tradition is the willingness to put other things aside and to be really immersed in that way until you've reached a certain depth and embodiment, basically. And that takes a very, very long time, much longer than we are used to thinking about in the reality of like weekend certifications and things like that. So from what I hear from my teachers, for example, a way that tradition has evolved that I know about from them is that, not so long ago, women didn't run ceremonies or work with ayahuasca or heal in this way that they do today. The work of an onaya as somebody who, diets and drinks ayahuasca, or uni as it's called in Shipibo, and heals in that way was the realm of men. and women had other healing traditions, but they were different. And the reason for that, as I'm told, is that doing dietas with master plants was considered incompatible with menstruation. And then some time ago, I'm not so sure exactly when, but I think it was kind of around the time that Maestra Inés started her studies, there was a shift in that understanding. And I'm not sure what happened or how, but a few women started to diet and started to learn. And they discovered actually that women learned quite fast and were naturally sensitive to the medicine and were able. And they discovered ways of working with the energy of menstruation so that it didn't become an impediment to the energy of the master plants. And so one of the things that you see as a bit of a standard across cultures of many, many different cultures, certainly indigenous cultures from the Americas, is that the energy of menstruation is considered a very strong energy, which can be an energetic impediment or disturbance to ceremonial spaces, to spaces where, you know, certain spiritual energy is being invoked. And so a lot of cultures that I've come into contact with, there's strict protocols and rules around menstruation and if a menstruating woman can be in the space or not, or if there's certain protections that she needs to do. And from my sort of post-feminist upbringing in the beginning, that was very hard to understand. And it felt like, oh, this is patriarchy, or this is like, you know, menstruation is beautiful, it's natural, it's powerful. And I had a lot of resistance to those kinds of thought forms. And then as I develop in sensitivity with this path that I'm walking, I've actually started to perceive the energy of menstruation and what it looks like and how it feels like, and that, yeah, it is a force which is intense. You know, I don't fully understand it yet, but it is something that I have personally felt the impact from. And part of what the way that the maestras share with me and orient me around that is like, well, they say everything is energy, you know, everything is energy, and all we need to do is to learn how to work with different energies. We have to learn to work with the energies of trauma, with the energies of abuse, with the energies of, you know, there's all kinds of energies that they have to learn to work with and to navigate within. And so this one other kind of energy is just another kind of energy that they need to learn to weave into order and harmony with their medicine. And so they talk about perceiving the energy of menstruation and actually weaving it into a beautiful design with the energy of their plants and adorning themselves with like beautiful protections and necklaces and bracelets. And so that way it doesn't become an energy which is impacting the space or impacting how, you know, things are working in that space. So that was something that they didn't know about before. That was a development, a pretty ginormous development and shift that came through people that were willing to experiment and challenge tradition. And probably those people were so grounded in their tradition and had gotten to such a level of mastery that they were willing to face that, right? If they hadn't had that training, it might not have gone off so well. But because they had that level of deep study, probably many, many years of long dietas that gave them a sense of trust, you know, we're asking the plants, show me, teach me, how do I work with this energy? And then learning, because the learning with plant medicines, for me, it doesn't seem like there's an endpoint. It's like an infinite universe of possibility that can take one in so many different directions. And what I appreciate about my teachers is that they are elderly people, you know, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers, and they don't say, I know it all. They keep studying, they keep dieting, they keep learning, they keep developing. And over the course of the 10 years that I've been with this family, Maestra Inés and her daughters, and I've seen this growing refinement and this growing ability in how they're developing. They haven't like reached a point where like, okay, I got my PhD. I stay here. They're keep learning. And Maestra Inés, for example, is a really fascinating person because she comes from this generation in which it wasn't very common for women to study in this way. But she started to do dietas, initially to heal herself from an illness. And then she felt such a strong calling to those plants that she was willing to make sacrifices that were very uncommon at that time. She was willing to, leave her husband and children, to give her children over into the care of the grandparents and, deal with the pressures of her partner that probably didn't want to be left alone while she goes off and diets, and really make these huge sacrifices because she felt compelled to learn along this path and this tradition. And one day she was talking to me, and she was, she doesn't speak a lot of Spanish, and so we don't have a lot of conversations in words. But then every once in a while, we're like alone together, and she starts telling me something, and I'm like, oh, you actually speak a lot more Spanish than you let on. So she started telling me about this time in her life when she just started traveling through Peru, searching for healers, of different kinds of healers from other traditions. And she said she came to the Sacred Valley and she did a dieta with San Pedro, and that this curiosity of like wanting to learn from other ways, or realizing that, maybe my tradition doesn't hold all of the keys, and the willingness, especially, this, I don't know if this was 20, 30 years ago, whenever it was, of being a person that at that point in her life hadn't gone out into the world beyond her own community, who didn't speak a lot of the common spoken language, and this courage and this drive, so I think that the evolutionary wisdom that is built into us as life, we are life, will always change and evolve and adapt in relationship. And when we bring in new influences, there's a necessary adaptation and evolution and change and growth that comes from that. And so it would be like to think that spirituality or spiritual tradition or plant medicines don't grow and evolve in the same way as the rest of life does would seem, wouldn't make sense to me. And at the same time, we live in a moment in which we have so much access to so many different streams of wisdom. And at least for Western people, one of the words that Imika uses to describe us we are orphans of our own story. We're cut off from our own lineages, and we have this hunger for something real and rooted, and we have a great deal of access to many, many different things. And because we haven't been grounded in something with a deep lineage, there can be this habit of like mixing things together and doing a lot of this and a lot of that without actually deepening into any one thing. There's a danger there. There's a real danger that needs to be paid attention to. So it's a balance, I think, of recognizing those two two things. One, that tradition isn't static, and second, that maintaining the protocols that have been designed by our predecessors through their generations upon generations of distilled knowledge and wisdom for a reason, for a valid reason of deep, deep integral study, is something that needs to be respected and taken really seriously, especially if I'm somebody that doesn't come from that culture, that doesn't come from that lineage, and I'm stepping into it.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. In the beginning, you mentioned this idea of ayahuasca as a feminine energy, and that's something that you came across. I think it's something many people describe. And then it was interesting because you were talking about Maestra Inés as a woman and how for the Shipibo, many years ago, women weren't part of Onaya. How do you see those archetypal masculine and feminine energies? I mean, for you, do you see ayahuasca as a feminine energy from a Shipibo vantage point, from your own vantage point, from what you've experienced working with the maestras? What do those energies mean for you? Like the archetypal masculine energy, the archetypal feminine energy. I think it's something very important, and it's something that in this day and age we have this kind of aversion of speaking about because we're worried about maybe crossing something. But in traditional cultures, usually these archetypal forces were very. There was a delineation, there was a clearness, and not even necessarily in the man and the woman, although I think in the man and the woman, but in this idea of polarities of these opposing complementary forces.
Yeah, thank you.
Not to put too much pressure on you.
I'm up for it. And I'm fascinated by this subject, actually. So, yeah, in the beginning, I heard a lot of the medicine as Mother Ayahuasca, Grandmother Ayahuasca, Mother Aya. And so I just assumed, that that's what it was. And when I came to sit with the Shipibo tradition, they explained to me that uni, the medicine that's made from these two plants, the ayahuasca vine and the chacruna leaf, or in Shipibo, nishi is the vine and kawa is the leaf. And so that nishi is a masculine energy and kawa is a feminine energy. And together they become one spirit, and together they become a door to open up the window of perception. So it's both, according to them. And that makes a lot of sense to me, that both of those energies are there, and that this doorway that is opened is only possible through the coming together of those two fundamental forces. And I really I see this understanding woven into the symbology or the design or the cosmology of a lot of different traditions. And the way that like a prayer pipe, they talk about the bowl being the feminine, or the womb, and the stem being the masculine, or the phallus, and then bringing those together. Or even the rattle, the gourd is the feminine and the handle is the masculine. And that understanding of those two primordial fundamental energies of creation, that we all come from a mother and a father, and that at least in this dimension of being, those energies are necessary for procreation, and that those energies create like a portal for the creative energy of life to flower. It's just part of it, right? It's just inherent. That's just the design of life. And so it's interesting with the master plants, with the teacher plants, plantas maestras. Some of them, from what I understand, they also each have their masculine aspect and their feminine aspect. But certain plants tend towards a more masculine expression, and certain plants tend towards what is considered to be a more feminine expression. And that's not something that I necessarily associate with gender, because I think that all humans and all parts of life contain both of these energies. And we can learn to work with those energies within ourselves, the polarity that exists within ourselves, but also in relationship that does have some connection to the bodies that we were born into, or to, these days, there's like an identification with a certain energetic pole that is expressed beyond, the body that it was born into. And so, for example, there was a time in my life where I really wanted to study, well, what is the essence of an integral, essential masculine according to nature, beyond the constructs of like human definition, if these masculine trees they're considered to carry this masculine energy, like, what is that? What does nature tell me about that energy? And so I did a long dieta with Tamamuri and Shiwawako, precisely because I really wanted to study this energy of masculinity. I wanted to study what that was inside of me, and I wanted to study, or what a healthy expression of that would be within, and what a healthy expression of that would be without. And so the plants, these masculine plants, taught me a lot, and certain things that they taught me, it feels like can be kind of corroborated by traditional thoughts, or things that are just, we can see in each other. And so, for example, one of the things that was very present in that dieta was like starting something and finishing it, And then another thing was like, if I say I'm going to do something, like to fulfill my word, this integrity. And it seemed to be, and then also the tree, it's this very vertical kind of being. It's a very directional kind of energy. And also they were teaching me a lot about the essence of providership and protectorship, which are also qualities that are associated to the masculine side of life. And so I think the plants have a lot to teach us about those two. You go to any deep wisdom stream, whether that be, yogic, Ayurvedic, Chinese medicine, yin yang, like that's kind of what shows up. There's like the undivided whole, which then divides into these two primordial energies. And from there, everything else is born. And so I think, that has so much to teach us, and the plants have a lot to teach us about that too. And it's been interesting, also to work with people who like identify as non-binary, or who have this, it's been part of their inquiry to, feel like, okay, I don't want to identify as a man or a woman, and yet when they come to the plants and start dieting, they're like, oh, the plants are kind of showing me this other perspective that that I can relate to, because it's coming from nature, and it's helping me come into harmony with those different aspects of myself and come into a sense of a peace about it.
I remember that there was this one time at the temple. I won't say who it was, but they weren't there at the temple, and they asked me to speak to Leela and Damian to get a pipe for them to have it sent. And Damian went in, and because he was making the pipes, and he took out a pipe and he was about to give it to me. This was for a woman, and Leela comes running out. Leela, and she's another Shipibo maestra, as is Damian. And Leela comes running out and she says, no, 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 you can't give her that pipe. It's too big. That's a man's pipe. You have to give her a smaller pipe. She needs a woman's pipe. And I remember thinking it was probably good that there was no women present to hear that. At the same time, I think you said something which from my experience has resonated to be very true. And it was something that I had heard, and maybe also as a man, there was some resistance to it. And I think you said something which is true, which is that in general, and again, these are generalities, there always can be exceptions. But as you were saying with Ines, that I think as a generality, women do tend to be more connected to this work. They are archetypally more sensitive. So I think usually there is a faster learning curve. Has there been something from your experience from having worked with in the Shipibo lineage with men and women, like different energies that you feel for them, or different roles that they serve, different medicines that they carry? Like how has that experience been for you, and maybe also from your conversations, what those roles traditionally are?
I'm not sure if it would be correct to say that this is true, like culturally for all Shipibo, because I think the family that I work with is quite unique. It is a very matrilineal family, and Maestra Inez is, you know, I would call her like an alpha female. She's like boss lady, and that's just her personality. I don't necessarily think that is common, across Shipibo culture. I don't know, because of my relationship to other Shipibo families mostly was happening at the temple, but in the last 10 years or so, it's like mainly through this family that I work with. So I see there that the women tend to be quite fierce, and that there's certain family members that are fiercer than others, or more have a dominant personality, so to speak. And so when we're having a meeting, the person, it's interesting. This is something I just noticed, like often if there was a meeting, they would defer to the man to speak. But if there was no man, it would be like the woman that had the most kind of fierce personality. And then if she wasn't there, then it would be the other one.
You can say that's Leela. I think we all.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and so if Leela's not there, then it's Adeline, and then finally Laura, she doesn't have like a super strong outward personality, but when there's no one else, she shares. And the depth of her wisdom and what she shares is like, oh, why haven't you been sharing before? But that's just something that I noticed. It's not really my place to like comment on it, but I've seen it as something that tends to be true not within a hierarchy, but within like a certain order that they all seem to feel comfortable with, at least from my perspective. And then because there's such a strong female presence, like there's like 4 female maestras that are really powerful and have done a lot of inner work and masterful within the family dynamics. It definitely feels like the the decision-making force or like is coming from the women, because they're the healers, they're the maestros, they're the ones that have really become wise people in a sense. And then, at least in that family environment, the men in the family are like much more like kind of supporting the vision of the women. But I wouldn't say that that's true from everything that I've seen in other Shipibo families. And Maestro Jose, for example, who is also a maestro, who has this depth of study and wisdom, like he at some point went and built his own place and probably felt more comfortable where he could grow into his own leadership and sort of develop, you know, his environment.
We kind of touched on this in the beginning, and you also touched on it early on. Like so many people, when they come to the Amazon, they've heard of ayahuasca as a medicine, as a plant spirit, as a master plant, as a teacher plant, a healer. You know, even working at the temple, I think a lot of people were surprised when they came and they signed up. I mean, it's usually even advertised, at least at the time. I think it's maybe changed, but as ayahuasca retreats. And there was always kind of this confusion when we would go on plant walks and, well, these are the teachers. And people would ask things like, well, I thought you just work with ayahuasca, or you diet ayahuasca, or ayahuasca is the main teacher. And you said this idea that for the Shipibo, ayahuasca is a diagnostic tool. It's something that opens your vision. It's something that allows you to see in a deeper way. But that all of these other plants were the healers. I think you even said like the one doing the corrective work, the ones going in and almost doing the surgery, the healing, the teaching. I think that's a foreign concept for a lot of people. Can you speak more about that, about how from your experience, ayahuasca plays a role, and then all of these other plants? I mean, you mentioned a couple of trees like tamamordi and shiwawaku, but like how that system is seen in a deeper way.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, in some ways, when I talk about this stuff, I also recognize that I'm a baby within my understanding. And I'm slowly starting to perceive from my own ability to feel and sense and see what the maestros have been telling me. And that just takes a lot of time. So I prefer, when I speak about things, I either prefer to talk about what they have told me directly or what I have direct experience of. And so, you know, I'm trying to think about before I started working with Shipibo maestros and I was in a ceremony, I remember having very healing experiences with ayahuasca where there'd be this kind of like energetic undoing or kind of surgeries that were happening, and where, yeah, it did feel like the spirit of ayahuasca was sharing information and healing and teaching me. And then when I came to meet this family, and yeah, they explained to me like ayahuasca is to see. It's the other plant doctors, which are actually doing the deeper reweaving and corrective work, as you said. So then I started to think back to those other experiences I had and to wonder, well, was that the medicine or was that other energies that were working through the expanded perception that the medicine provides? Because I think in the space of opening up those doors of perception, we access like different energies that exist on different planes, whether we want to call those spirits or guides, or I don't know, you know, they might have many different names in different traditions, but those forces are like, oh, now we have access. Now we can start, and some of those forces are benevolent, and then some of those forces, we won't say too much about that. But when I really started to do dietas myself and start to perceive how the energies of these other plants were being invoked and directed through the conduit, through the expanded perception of ayahuasca, I definitely saw like a great shift from what I had ever seen before. And the results, the tangible, lasting results of the effect of that work of the Icaros and the master plants just has taken on another dimension. It's something that I can't really compare to my previous experience. So, and that's I don't often work with other plant medicines myself, but I have talked to a few friends that have a lot of plant dietas, and for example, they work with mushrooms. Maybe they don't have access to ayahuasca and they work with mushrooms, and they started to tell me how mushrooms worked in the same way. They opened up this expanded perception and awareness that then their plant allies started to come through and work through that, window that was opened by the mushrooms. And of course, I do believe the mushrooms and ayahuasca have their own spirit, that they have a consciousness and a wisdom, but maybe their primary function is just this sort of like opening up of perception. And then each plant doctor has kind of its specialty. And so we hear about love plants or warmi plants that are working with re-enchanting us, with opening the heart, with connecting us to loving energies and our emotions. And then we hear about, maybe we could call them power plants. And some of those plants are used for different reasons. If somebody has like an infection and their blood needs to be cleaned, the spirit of tamamuri can support that better than other plants. If somebody has a lot of body pain and arthritis, maybe chiricsanango or bobensana, our plant spirits, when you ingest them physically, they also support with those, but the spirit of that plant is also going to help for those specific conditions and ailments. If you have an emotional wound or loss or childhood trauma, bobensana, renakia are kind of specialists in that type of healing. And so when I hear the maestros sing, they're singing to their pharmacy. They're singing to all of the pharmacy, and they're bringing in different energies according to what's needed for the person that they're working on and in the space in general. And the way that I started to perceive the different energies of the plants myself, and I think this is different from everyone. Some people I know say, well, I just know. It's like, oh, this plant is with me. For me, it's very much about the colors that I'm seeing. Certain colors I associate with certain plants. And so when those colors show up, I know that that plant is with me and that it's working on something specific. And knowing that, I can start to work with that plant in a more conscious way.
And can you speak a bit more about that idea of I think a lot of people are familiar with that idea, if nothing else, just in concept, if not maybe experiential practice. But that idea of calling on a plant, that idea of having a plant ally, of learning for a plant, whether it's through Dieta or however one does that, like what What has been that experience for you of forming a relationship with the plant? I mean, because again, for most people, that's very far outside of our worldview. I mean, and yet maybe not also. I mean, I think many people, if they garden, they have relationships with plants, or many people feel connected to a certain tree. They may even feel the tree heals them by spending time in that with that tree. But what is for you that what has that been your experience? And again, maybe from the conversations with the ladies, how did they speak about that forming a relationship with the plant? To be able to eat to call upon it to heal, because that's a pretty amazing superpower.
Yeah. In some way, even though it might feel very foreign or very outside of our direct experience, it's a it's a relational capacity that I think is wired into us, you know? And even if we don't have direct experience of that way of relating to the natural world, or an understanding that the elements of nature have sentience, and um, you know, that it's possible to develop like a relation that includes dialogue, that includes, exchange of information. Um, it's something that certainly at some point, some of our ancestors were raised within that knowledge and had those practices. And so what I see happening when people come to work with the plants, it's sort of like, oh, I'm just waking up or remembering something that feels actually very natural and makes a lot of sense. And why did no one tell me about this before? And then, of course, there's always others that it's a bit of more of a struggle. There's a lot of skepticism, and there's a lot of very deep programming that the physical world is inanimate, made up of inanimate matter, that's just dead matter. Or it might have life force, but it doesn't have consciousness. Or that a rock or a water or a plant is an even lower form of consciousness than an animal. We have this hierarchy. And so waking up to the understanding, which at first is conceptual and then becomes embodied, that a plant is like a master teacher of consciousness. It's like, and sometimes I wonder if the ways that the plants are teaching me, are they transmitting wisdom to me, or am I simply becoming connected to a field of wisdom which awakens the wisdom which is already inside of me? Are the insights I'm having coming from an external consciousness, or is it just that the film on my perception and connection to my own intuition and inner knowing has been removed? I'm not sure exactly where the line there lies, or if there's a line, or if it's the same thing. So in the beginning, it sounds like a really nice romantic idea that I'm into, but I don't really know how to go about it, And at least when I started dieting, I kind of didn't think I had to do anything. I just have to drink the plant, and then it's going to give me all these gifts and presents. And I remember my first Shipibo diet was with Marusa. And I was young and kind of giddy, and, I was into the process, but I wasn't really taking it seriously. I wasn't really doing my work. I was kind of just distracted and didn't even know what doing the work was. And so I remember one night having a very clear dream in which I had been invited to a dinner by these 3 women, and the dinner was all Dieta food. So I would interpret that as like, these are the plant teachers and they've invited me to the Dieta. It's being represented by the Dieta food. And then I was kind of like, I didn't really want to be there. And I was thinking, oh, I should probably reciprocate. But I was like, maybe I can just go buy one of those like prepackaged bath product things, and so I excused myself to go reciprocate and buy this, very thoughtless, generic gift. But my actual intention was I wanted to go to the supermarket to get a cappuccino. And so, so I went to the supermarket, I got my cappuccino, and I was like, oh, do you have one of these, products, these prepackaged gifts? And they're like, no, but you could make one yourself, get a basket. And then I was like, what should I put in there? And the salesperson was like, what about shoe polish? Everybody loves shoe polish. And I was like, yeah, sure, put it in. And then I picked up this other like gadget that was like made in China, like little handheld, it was just like junk, thoughtless junk that I was doing from some concept that I should reciprocate. But really, I was just in there for my selfish intentions to drink this cappuccino. So when I woke up from that dream, I was like, oh, I don't think the plant's very impressed with my efforts. I had to look at it, and I think, in the context of a dieta, one of the ways that the plants teach us is they give us these dreams which grossly exaggerate certain habits that we have, like almost make a caricature of it and stick in our face and be like, this is you. And then if we have enough self-awareness, we can be like, oh, yeah, that's what I'm doing, And so one of the things that happens for me anyway is in the dieta, the kinds of dreams I have are quite distinct from dreams that I have outside of dieta. And they're very symbolic and they're very self-reflective. They're showing me about me, usually not in a positive light. And then there's other kinds of dreams in which, direct information and guidance is given, or certain gifts, things like that. And then a lot of it is learning what it means to invest the energy of my attention and awareness into something very intangible. And so the maestras would tell me, you have to have this single pointed focus and strip away everything else and put all of your awareness on this one relationship with purpose and intention. What am I here for? What am I asking from this relationship, from this plant? What am I giving? And in the beginning, I really had no idea how to do that. I had a crazy monkey mind. And so in the beginning, a lot of it was just seeing where I'm, kind of a mess, and having the patience for the plant and the Icaros to work on me. And then slowly, as I listen to what the maestros tell me to do, and I bring more attention and focus and more dialogue, what I would call prayer, it's a certain energy and space of dialogue, which I reach for a quality of like a sacred communication, like where I access a communication that comes from a deeply sincere part of my heart. And when I manage to come from that place and invite a relationship, a connection to the plant spirit, which might not be super obvious, the more I do that, the more I get evidence that there's a response. And so a friend of mine that also facilitates with me, she said, for the first couple of years, she didn't feel anything from the plants, but she kept smoking my pipe every single day, talking to the plants, talking to them, investing in the relationship. And then one day she started to perceive the relationship that had been created. And she started to see how all of those prayers had actually been feeding this relationship until the moment where she had enough awareness and perception and sensitivity and alignment that she could perceive it herself. So it's a long-term investment, and the returns are great, but it's not going to necessarily be something that we get immediate evidence of. And that's really hard to explain to people, because we haven't been taught how to have that kind of patience to develop something. And so in the beginning, the relationship might be fed through these very small glimpses, and then step by step growing into something, and then it becomes almost a miracle when when I find myself feeling not so good, and then I remember to call on my plant allies, or I work with my pipe, and then suddenly I feel an energetic support in a tangible way. Wow, or if I'm in ceremony and then I call on a certain plant and it shows up, that feels like a living miracle. But it didn't happen immediately. It took a lot of time, and it is taking a lot of time for that evidence to reveal itself. And Maestra Lila tells me the same thing. She's like, in the beginning, I didn't understand anything. I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't have any connection. The plant didn't tell me anything. It was really frustrating. So the maestros themselves say it was like that for them too.
How much do you think, like a lot of that, there is a rationality behind it, and I think dreams are such a beautiful language that's often not spoken about in this path, and that is one of the direct forms of communication. That's a very deep teacher. Even with that, though, I think we can rationalize that. We can learn from it. I think the example you gave is beautiful, and maybe even if you can share a bit more about dreams, because I think it's a theme that's very often not touched about or touched on in this work, and usually in these traditions, it's seen as one of the primary ways that the teaching can happen. And then kind of a part two to that question is, even when you were speaking about Amika, there was two particular times that I was remembering when you were speaking about him, and this idea of these healing codes. And I almost can't put it in words, and I almost don't want to put it into words, because I think it takes away some of the sacredness of it. But it was very clear to me that something was transmitted, and I mean, I was lost in time and in space, but something I felt was implanted. And then also, I mean, I even got a bit emotional thinking about it. There was another time when I was sitting with him, and there was this very deep work that was done. And when you were speaking about this technology, I mean, I think technology is a very beautiful way of speaking of these traditions. And it's almost something that is ineffable, something that's very difficult. I mean, I think it can be put into words, and that's perhaps all of our evolution of one day being able to put it into words. But it was something very personal, because I come from the US, and there was actually a Lakota man there, and without getting too much into it, he did this beautiful healing between him and myself of I think aspects of both of us that were ancestrally even potentially in conflict. But I can't, I'm sure if I spoke about it for 15 minutes, I could give some reference to it, but on the one, I don't want to. But also because it's very difficult to put into words, like so many of these experiences, I think as we begin to put them in words, even for someone to listen to that, maybe it would resonate, but there would be a whole world that also wouldn't be fully comprehended, because part is that internal world, which is so layered and so complex. How much of the Dieta do you think can be spoken about or learned through words? This also touches on another topic, which I think you said very beautifully and very profoundly, which was with your teacher Ines, that you do have conversations, but usually they're quite limited, and sometimes maybe they're not. But you said, and I could be wrong, but it seemed like you were alluding to something that a lot of her teaching wasn't in the verbal realm, that it was beyond that. And that's something I've experienced myself with who I would consider to be my main teacher, who speaks pretty good Spanish. But we also actually, even though I spent a very long time with him, we had very few conversations. But there was a very direct teaching that happened in the Dieta space, a nonverbal teaching. I know this is a huge question, but maybe just speaking about those two ideas, about this knowledge that's transmitted, whether through dreams or through something direct, but also this kind of ineffable or mystery that's a bit difficult to even put into words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. There's so much there. Um, as I understand it, the the importance of having a teacher, which today is almost becoming obscured a bit because there's a narrative out there that says like the time of teachers is done. We all have our direct line to source and the information is accessible to everyone. But in the true sense of a teacher that comes from a millennial lineage, there's an understanding that something is being transmitted from generation to generation. And as that energy is transmitted and received by the next generation, it's refined, it's cultivated, it's something is added to it. And so it just, when I think about it, what that actually means energetically, it's huge, it's massive, you know? And so, although if you're talking about the Shipibo way of learning, a big part of it comes from the plants, but a big part of it comes from the transmission of relationship and lineage that's coming from the teacher. So, you know, when the maestros talk to me, they say, well, if someone just drinks a plant on their own, it's not really a dieta, because a dieta in the true sense of the form has to be planted, has to be transmitted from this lineage. And so in the beginning, I don't think I really understood that. And at some point, I think, you know, Maestro Jose started to tell me, well, there's different kinds of Icaros. There's Icaros of knowledge, and there's Icaros which are like just healing the person. When you're receiving an Icaro of knowledge, this kind of wisdom is being planted in you. And so when and how that knowledge flowers into something tangible is maybe something that can't be defined, because I'm sure that I've received many gifts that I had no idea I was receiving, and they took their time to open within me according to my state of readiness. And there's probably latent things in me that haven't developed. So someone like Imika or Inez or anyone that's been the recipient, you know, it's like at some point you become the initiator. You've been initiated, you've had those codes implanted within you, and you become capable of transmitting those codes. And that's something that I know can only be earned. And for example, they tell me, my Shipibo teachers, that when a maestro passes on, they choose someone in their family to give over the transmission of the all of, you know, their medicine, what they've received from their teachers. They give that over to the next generation before they pass. And then that person becomes the recipient and the continuation of the lineage. And one of the things that I find really fascinating about Imika is that according to the ancestral story of the Tubu, there was a part of the story which was untold, in which the last generations of the Tubu, the way that they're, according to the ancestral story, the way that that was transmitted was that it became part of like a new people, a people that didn't look like indigenous Tubu people. And it took on this other form into what they call the Dirumasan, the people of the dawn. And then he said, so when we got displaced from our traditional territories and, you know, landed in the slums of Bogota and completely disconnected from our way of being, and we started to meet these other people, Western people that didn't look like us, but that were interested in us, we recognized that these were the Diromasa, the people of the dawn. This was the continuation of the seed of who we are, and therefore it is our duty to transmit it all to them, because that's the continuation of this essence that we are. And I'm getting chills as I talk about it. It's very delicate to talk about this publicly, but I understand it gives me some sense of purpose that maybe part of the reason why all these different nations and people from around the world, coming from different lineages, and a lot of us from mixed lineages, and a lot of us from lineages that have been severed from, you know, our ancestral way, diluted or lost our stories of origin. And then somehow, you know, the maestros talk about how the plants call us, that we respond to a call from these spiritual beings that's awakened in our hearts, and we find our way to the Amazon. And then these seeds of knowledge are being transmitted. They're being placed in us. To what end? Perhaps simply to ensure the survival, the continuation. And when I look at how plants work, you know, their profuse dispersal of seeds. I remember in one dieta, I was like walking through the grass, and then I would get these hundreds of seeds stuck to my pants every time. I'd spend all these hours picking up the seeds, and then I started to wonder, out of all of these thousands upon thousands of seeds that get dispersed, you know, through humans and animals walking through this passive patch of grass, I wonder how many of those are actually going to take root and become another plant. Probably a very small portion, but the plant doesn't care about that. The plant's like, I'm going to survive. I'm going to throw as many seeds as I can in as many directions as I can. Some of them will land, some of them won't. Some of them will find good conditions in which to grow, and some of them won't. It doesn't matter, you know? And so when I see plants doing that, I wonder maybe if that's, you know, what's happening right now. And there's complexity. Not all of what's happening can be said to be good or to be in alignment. But if I'm somebody that walks the path of being a student of the plants and an emissary and somebody that cares about listening and acting in a way that feels in alignment with this knowledge that's been planted in me, then the best thing I can do is to make sure that the seeds that are being transmitted find good soil to land in. And so if good soil means that the people receiving those seeds are given enough information about how to take care of them so that there's a chance, you know, and part of that belongs to the mystery. And so in my role, a big part of what I'm trying to do is help the information to be transmitted in a way that it can be understood by the Western mind. Because I have a Western mind, I can understand the craziness of the Western mind. And then I have enough of a trajectory with a tradition that this has become embodied to a certain extent with me. And so when I'm transmitting the information through my words, I'm transmitting understanding in a conceptual way, but I'm also transmitting energetically the embodiment of what I've received. So I personally have a certain gift with language and finding ways to say things in a way that can be received and understood. And then I combine that, or my intention within that is that the plants are with me and I'm a vessel of their, what they want to say and the energy that they want to transmit. So sometimes I do, when people are interested in dieting, I do like an open information call where people can join and I share about it. And they ask, well, how do I know which lineage to go to? How do I know whether it's a good teacher? And one of the things that I sometimes say is you will feel the resonance. But in this moment, one of the ways that you can feel the resonance is through your resonance with how I'm speaking and what you feel as I'm speaking. And I might not be a Shipibo person, but in this moment, I am a transmitter of that energy in a new way, and so to trust whatever you feel. And if you don't resonate, well, to trust that too.
Yeah. In the beginning, you said something very interesting, which was this kind of remembrance that you were a child of God, the first time you worked with ayahuasca, and also this kind of innate trust that you had that in the human realm, that obviously we're all prone to that duality, to light and dark, good and bad. In maybe a Christian sense, we've sinned in the true sense of that word, usually not the way it's translated, but that we're always missing the mark. It's the same root as yoga, to steer, to always try and come back to center. But that we're human, we're human beings. And part of the faith you had was this kind of purity or divinity of nature. I think one of the things that these plants can also open us to is this kind of archetype of good and evil, light and dark, good and bad. You even touched on it a little bit, of these benevolent forces. What has that been like in your journey? Like, do you still share that kind of purity, that in an ultimate sense nature is good? Have there been things that, I've heard very beautifully put, you also mentioned this idea that doubts come, and I think doubts are very good. They're very good teachers. It's a teacher of self-reflection. And it can be said that devil is in the doubt. Like if we're overcome by doubt, then we never have the ability to move forward. But in that realm of kind of purity versus the other side of that, have there been challenges, obstacles, things that have tested you on that way? And where do you find that resolve to continue moving towards that light?
Mm-hmm. It seems like in this dimension, we are subject to duality. Maybe there's a state of being beyond, in yoga, they would call it Maya, beyond the illusion of division and scarcity and lack, where in essence, everything is one. And yet, I don't know why exactly, but in this dimension of being, we're subject to duality. And personally, the narrative which gives me a sense of purpose about it is that I'm here to learn, and I'm here to develop mastery. I'm here to find my way back to that unity through the challenge and the illusion of separation, lack, good and bad, the lived experience of opposition and division and things like that. And then through that experience, I'm forced to reach for something beyond that. And again, what we're talking about is really hard to describe with words. And so, yeah, in this reality that we inhabit, it seems pretty obvious to me that there is evil. There's things that are happening which are gross distortions, and there's things about our history that are just crimes. What's it called? I can't think of the word right now, but and then in the world of the Shipibo cosmovision, I don't know if you would call that's part of it too. There's a lot of talk about envidia, jealousies, and attacks, and oscuridad, darkness, and so as I go deeper into that world, I see what the maestras are talking about, and see that there's something real about that. And yet, if I focus too much there and give too much power to those ideas, then I can get caught in an idea of being like a victim, or that I'm not safe, or one of the most prevalent ideas, or maybe I could even call it like a false god of scarcity, that there's not enough, and because there's not enough, I need to take from the other, or I need to defend what's mine, or that idea of scarcity is probably at the root of all of the wars and all of the tendency towards hoarding and excess and extraction, like this protection against not having, this fear of not having enough that drives us to the opposite extreme, which has created a lot of pain and suffering in the world. And then the seductions of power, which in this world of plant medicine or plant shamanism, whatever you want to call it, when you get access to spiritual power, you also get access to power, sex, and money are those three great temptations that we're all subject to. And that's true in the world of spirituality as well, perhaps even magnified, the distortions that can happen, the temptations. Once I get access to power, if I haven't really looked at my own wounding and my pain of not feeling enough or not having enough, and then I get access to power prematurely, that unhealed wound is going to lead me to the temptation and the seduction of having power over, or how I use my sexuality, how I amass wealth and use the power of wealth. All of that, it's kind of mixed in. So in the Shipibo world, they say one of the reasons you want to have a good teacher is because the plants will give you access to power. And then if you don't have a good teacher and you've prematurely accessed power, you can start to be seduced by power, and you can start to be seduced into having power over. So if you have a good teacher anchored in the light, I'm not elevating the idea of light over darkness. But if you have a teacher that's anchored in, in Shipibo, we have the word hakun, which is good, but it has also been translated to that which is life generating, So that which is life generating is not life generating for just one person while others suffer. It's life generating for everyone. So somebody that's accessing spiritual power is accessing that spiritual power to be in service of the collective. And if you don't have a teacher, you haven't purified your own ego wounds, and you haven't faced the places that you're operating from lack and fear of lack, then you can be seduced into this power. And that's an archetypical story, when you go back through these different narratives and stories that have been passed down in different traditions, they talk about those same things. That seems to be part of the design of what we're here to learn about and master. And maybe that's always going to be part of the Earth School, if you can call it an Earth School.
Yeah. You mentioned when you were speaking about the Santo Daime and the offshoots, this mix of Christianity and these African Angola traditions. It's interesting because even when I was thinking of Angola and the work with the Gabon, I mean they're geographically very very close to each other. Maybe with the Shipibo there's less of that African influence, although I would imagine there is. It's maybe hard to touch on, but I think there are aspects that have influenced. Certainly there are Christian influences, Spanish influences, Portuguese influences. I think one of it's a very complex topic, and probably we won't get so deep into it, but I think it's interesting having worked in these Brazilian traditions, these kind of syncretic traditions, and seeing how these different elements can blend together. Indigenous ayahuasca use, daime use, African spiritism, Portuguese, or Brazil's a mix, not just Portuguese, but European, maybe Christianity. A lot of Shipibo either are Christians or invoke Christianity into their work. Obviously, not all, and it's a very complex topic. But what has been your experience with that? I mean, even some can be language, and language is also very tricky too, how we translate things. But even very often, Shipibo will speak in terms of God, almost in this Christianized version of speaking about God. And I think for a lot of people, it's especially coming from the outside, it's hard to kind of like we were touching in the beginning. It's hard to decompartmentalize those things like. That's one system, whether it's Amazonian shamanism, Christianity is something different, African spiritism is something different. How have you seen some of those different elements come to play in the Shipibo tradition?
Hmm.
Because most people are probably familiar, but I mean, South America is a very syncretic place. I mean, you have all sorts of different traditions that came together. I mean, it's very unique in that you have indigenous traditions, but you have just much like America or all of the Americas. I mean, there's really an influx of all sorts of people, all sorts of beliefs, all sorts of different worldviews. So, is there anything you've seen that you can maybe see that the Shipibo have adopted or work with other archetypes that from people from the outside may seem as something like foreign or not ancestrally theirs?
Yeah, the main thing I think would be elements of Christianity, which surprised me at first because in a lot of other parts of the Americas, when through colonization and Christianization and, the doctrine of discovery and this idea that that the colonization and the destruction of culture was mandated through God and blessed or, divinely ordained. And the suppression of other forms of spirituality and tradition as being some part of the devil, according to this Christianized view. So in a lot of other parts of the world, there's deep trauma that has evolved from the condemnation of this enforced Christianity, whether that be through residential schools or having it be illegal to practice one's own form of spirituality, or, being punished, all of the things. And it seems like, from what the maestras tell me and from, the evidence of working with them, that some of this Christian influences could be absorbed, but that they weren't persecuted for practicing their traditions. And so Inez and the family, they talk about when the missionaries first came to the village, and they were their hermanos en Dios, their brothers in God, and they seemed to have a good experience about them, and they felt like they were good people, and they opened them up to good things, and they have a lot of respect for the Bible as like a holy book. And so it seems to have had a positive influence that didn't counter their own tradition or obstruct the practicing of their own tradition, which I think is pretty rare in the scheme of things. So one of the things I've heard is this practice of dieting the Bible, of doing a dieta with the Bible. As you can do a dieta of a plant and gain certain spiritual energy. You can do the dieta of the spiritual body of energy, which is the Bible. And so I remember one time asking a maestro, I think it was Maestro Francisco, because he had done a dieta with the Bible. And I said, how do you do a dieta of the Bible? And he said, well, we cook a big pot of ayahuasca and we put like a grate over top of the ayahuasca. And while it's cooking, we put an open Bible. And then the heat gets absorbed up into the Bible, and the Bible sweats its juice into the ayahuasca. And then we drink the ayahuasca. And I was like, what? That is so crazy and so cool, And then they follow these restrictions. And he's like, and every night we read the Bible. And then, he's like, and then I received my Ícaro from el Señor Jesus Cristo. So it was interesting to me that influence of Christianity was able to be absorbed and welcomed in this very new way and adapted to what they already knew, without conflict or without suppression of their own ways. And I don't know exactly what the history of the missionary presence in the Shipibo world and how that evolved. I don't know enough about it. But from what I hear, it seems to be something that wasn't that traumatizing. And so the elements of Christianity, perhaps in their energetic, pure form, and Maestro Francisco said, sometimes Jesus appears to me in my vision in a white doctor's coat, and he's helping me do my healings. And there's absolutely no conflict. And for myself, my father came from a Catholic family and was super traumatized from Catholicism and totally rejected his religion. And so I didn't grow up going to church, and even I grew up with a bit of disdain, unspoken disdain for the Bible, for Christianity. And so I had a bit of a prejudice against it. Although I was interested and curious about Jesus as a spiritual awakened teacher. I did sense that there was something there. But when I went to Brazil and I sat with the Santo Daime, And in the beginning, I found it really difficult, to say all of these Hail Marys. And there was this energy of kind of a glorification of suffering, a spiritual suffering that I didn't really get. And so I was coming in the beginning with a little bit of judgment towards these influences which were foreign to me. But through just being there and drinking the medicine, I started to connect with maybe the energies of Christ consciousness or of Mother Mary, of, the energies in its pure form beyond human indoctrination and all of the ways in which that energy has been corrupted according to human aims. And I started to feel the power of that in such a beautiful way. And it really, really opened my heart up to that as a healing force. And so I imagine that the Shipibo people that have turned to Christianity not as a religion, but as like a spiritual energy that they connect with through the expanded vision brought on by ayahuasca, they're connecting to the essence. And they're like, oh yeah, this is good. There's a lot of light here. There's a lot of healing power here. We can work with this.
Yeah. Yeah, beautifully put. At one point, I think you said very beautifully that that these plant medicine paths can take us in so many different directions, that it's like a universe. It's also never-ending learning. And each person is so individual, so unique. Obviously, for some people, they may be drawn to maybe one day serving medicine or working in some capacity that reflects how they've seen it worked with. But from your experience, having worked with a lot of people now, what do you think are some of those paths that plant medicine can point people towards? Because I think there is an act of remembering, of coming home to who you truly are, and that can take so many forms. But maybe just thoughts or reflections, examples of like directions that this work can take people in. Because I think it's often this work is spoken of in a very particular way, that has a very particular shape, form, and maybe even now in this kind of quote unquote psychedelic renaissance, it's being used in a very particular way to treat very specific things. But what do you see as the potentialities, the realities of these plants?
I think we're part of a currently unfolding evolution that is in the process of revealing itself. And traditionally, for example, Shipibo maestros talk about two paths, the path of healing and the path of learning. And at some point, usually the personal healing, I'm going to the plants for personal healing. But once I do enough of that, I start to learn, and I start to learn how to heal. And in a traditional sense, learning how to heal would mean becoming a maestro and working with Icaros and working with others, like serving medicine and working on them in ceremony. And yet with this influx of foreigners coming to the medicine, I don't necessarily think in general that it's our role to become like traditional Onayabo serving medicine. At least not while the originals are still here, But then there's ways that the medicine and the knowledge and the wisdom that has been planted in us wants to work through us. That is an unfolding inquiry. And so there's a lot that's probably going to evolve in our lifetime as there's not that many people that have really taken this on to such a degree that, or maybe there is a lot of people, but anyway, it's depending on how you look at it. And For example, one of the things that really lights me up in this moment of my own personal journey is wanting to curate spaces with others who have a similar trajectory to me, like a similar level of personal inquiry, personal healing work, and translating that to then be in service and start to activate like the next level of the school. You know, together, there's something that I feel is possible if I'm in an environment with contemporaries that are, you know, they've done enough of the clearing of the pain of the past that they're able to perceive and perhaps perceive into the possibilities of the future. And when we come together, we magnetize that potential and potentially access direction for how to create real-time, real-world solutions for the immense, you know, challenges that we're facing in this moment, planetarily, as a human race. I see a lot of people doing plant dietas or working with plant medicine that work in some kind of capacity with others, whether that be through healing touch or talk therapy. There's a way in which the wisdom of the plants is starting to be transmitted in their work with others. That seems to be happening. And then personally, I feel there's a great potential that some of the deepest human wounding that we carry, that we haven't fully been able to face yet, has to do with the divisions and the history of harm, you know, from our colonial inheritance, what the harm that we've inherited, you know, from the colonialism that has shaped our society, and the inequities that exist within society because of that. And I think there's been a lot of work done sort of geared towards like personal healing in the plant medicine realm. And I think there's a potential that's been shown to me through the plants of how we can access plant medicine to heal a bit more collectively and to collectively face the impact which lives in our bodies of and the inequities that exist, you know, through geography, class, race, and the huge distortions of like how wealth is distributed and who has access to what. Like there's a lot of work to be done that we haven't begun to do. And I think there's a potential. I don't know what that is yet, but I'm curious, I'm interested, and I'm studying. And I'm paying attention to the synchronicities that are showing up in my life for what it means to begin stewarding the medicine that's been planted in me towards like something that I'm sensing, but not completely, you know, seeing fully yet.
Kind of wrapping this full circle, because we're coming up, I think, on our 3-hour mark. You said very beautifully in the beginning that one of the messages that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that one of the messages the first time you drank ayahuasca gave you was that it was this tool for restoring the primordial order, and that also that this direct experience that all is one, that we're a child of God. over the years, have you gained any more, this is a big question, but have you gained any more insight into what that primordial order is? I mean, with this envisioning of the future, um, what for you does that mean, like a primordial order? What is something that's ordered, that's old beyond what we can describe, like that innate nature of this world, or that universe that we as humans can begin to come into alignment to?
That's a big question.
Because it's interesting, you use that word alignment, which I would imagine, whether consciously or unconscious, that there is, and even as you said, I think that the maestros often use that idea of coming into alignment, or that word hakun, like that generative force, that life-giving force. Do you have any insight from your work of what that looks like, what that entails? Because it seemed like that was also the last thing you were speaking about, was some direction of a movement into a future in the realm of humans.
Mhm. Um, I feel like I've been given glimpses, and that many of us have been given glimpses. And that first experience, when I felt from the inside, I am a beloved child of God, or I am a beloved child of all that is. I am part, I belong, I am, all of us. It became, it's not something that then from there on, that's how I felt in every moment of my life. I actually have probably never felt it to that degree again. But it's a reference point that I can never forget. And it's an orientation that continues to guide me. And so I believe that the original instructions, so to speak, like when you talk to different indigenous nations, many of them carry, we use the words technologies, but these practices which were given to them often from divine spiritual origins, that were practices of how to maintain order and harmony and coherence and, a good life. A good life is a life which includes all of life. It's a good life in relationship. It's being in good relationship. And so it seems like in this moment, we're in the process of remembering practices that in the past were held and kept and passed down. And a lot of that has been obscured or wiped out. And a lot of it exists in kind of fragment form. But it seems like there's a potential now to bring forth the pieces of original knowledge that have been kept, that have been retained, and that the different keepers of those fragments, part of what's happening is like we're able to come together and exchange, and they're like pieces of a puzzle. And as we're bringing back the pieces of the puzzle, the design of life is being revealed. So that's a very kind of symbolic representation of something that we need to figure out how to do in the practical way, in the lived experience way. But I think it has there within some of the keys that we've talked about here in terms of like healing codes, stories, songs, and dances. Those are the keys that awaken that original knowledge. And so by some miracle, some of those keys, some of those codes have been kept. They're still available to us. But some of those codes and those keys, the keepers of those things they're like the last generations. And in some sense, there's not new generations stepping forward within their own family lineages to carry it. And so we're in this moment where I think of great importance to realize how precious those things are. And for those of us that have begun to sense how precious those things are, to speak as a voice for those things, so that they might, whatever the potential is that they have to bring to humanity, that they can serve that potential. And then perhaps, as Yimika says, he doesn't know the next part of the story. He only knows that he's supposed to hand over, to transmit as much knowledge as possible. And then it's up to us, it's up to the future generations to see what we do with that, whether life on this planet continues or not.
That's a beautiful and terrifying way to end the conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think very true and very, very vital. It's been amazing, Jess. We're close to 3 hours. Is there anything that we didn't speak of that you'd like to talk about before we close?
Well, I assume that you'll maybe share information about the center that I work with, Niwet Al Shobo. People's curiosity was piqued to know about the work that we're doing there. I know that I can stand fully behind the work that's happening there on the part of the maestros and on the part of the Western team of support staff that help to bridge that. And also, one of the newer initiatives that I've been working on with a dear friend of mine, Karina Terzo, is feeling the need to support access of marginalized communities to medicine spaces and healing. And so we've created a fund under the umbrella of her not-for-profit. And a big part of, where I'd like to focus is just really ensuring that this kind of medicine, this kind of healing that is so essential for humanity in this moment of time gets out to anybody that needs it, regardless of their financial conditions or their, that feels like part of what the plants are asking me to do is to recognize that in this moment in time, these kind of healing spaces are accessible to a certain portion of the population, and that as much as possible, I need to take responsibility for helping the plants and the wisdom of the plants and the remembering that's available through the healing codes gets out to anybody that needs it, and as many as people that are ready and available for that.
And if people want to reach out to you, or they're interested in Niwet Al Shobo or the initiative, the not-for-profit, are there directions you can point them to? Website, social media?
Definitely, yeah. I have a website. The center has a website. And then for the not-for-profit, there's also a page on a website that I can direct people to. I don't know if you'll just include those links in the info, or how do we do that?
Maybe say them also, because sometimes I think people get lazy and don't check the show notes. So it's always good to speak it too.
Right. So my personal website is wakinglucid.com. So it's waking-lucid.com. And then the site for the center is called niwedaoshobo.com, niweraoxobo.com. And then the Living Wisdom Fund, which is under the 501c3 umbrella of the ARC. I would probably have to look that up. I should have. Well, anyway, it's.
We can include that in the show notes.
We'll
So
include that, okay.
yeah. Well, amazing, Jess. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom. I was just remembering that there was a ceremony at the temple which was quite full on, and almost always I would go back to my tambo, my little jungle hut after, because I just found it so magical to be alone and in nature. My tambo is quite far removed from everyone, and I like that. But one night I stayed in the Maloka, and I heard this angelic voice singing, and in my meditación, I thought it must have been a spirit singing to me. And I went to Debbie the next day, who I think was maybe facilitating or in the center, and I was like, I heard this incredible voice last night. I couldn't believe it. It was coming from the pond. And she was like, oh, that was Jessica sitting out at the pond. And okay, that makes sense. You have a beautiful presence. I think your dedication is just commendable, and the reverence you have and the wisdom that you speak from really shines out. And I've also spent quite a bit of time, not as much as you now, working with those ladies, and especially Alila. We shared a lot of time together, and they do beautiful work. They're amazing women. So I can only say good things about them. But thank you so much for coming on, and I wish you the best in your journey. And I'm sure we'll connect again soon. And if I can help with anything, always let me know as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. You ask really good questions. You bring it out in the good way. So yeah, it's been nice to reconnect, and I hope to be in touch.
If you enjoyed my recent interview with Dr. Nathan Bryan and the health effects of nitric oxide, and are curious to work with this very interesting molecule, as listeners of the show, you receive 10% off all orders from their website using the code UNIVERSE at checkout. I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Bryan and his holistic approach to health, which really emphasizes not adding on or doing more things, but first focusing on the unhealthy habits that limit our own endogenous production of nitric oxide. So focusing on that first, and then working to add some supplementation. I think he's doing really good work and is very much in alignment with my own philosophy. So check them out, and I will put a link to their website and the discount code UNIVERSE in the show notes. All right, everyone, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It was really beautiful, special for me to sit down and reconnect to Jessica. We've known each other for a long time, shared, I think, a very unique trajectory in our life experiences together. I think she has a lot of wisdom, a lot of experiential wisdom to share. So I trust you all got a lot out of that episode. If you're interested in working with myself, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org. We have all of our upcoming plant medicine retreats there. If you're interested in integration work, consultation work, there's links to all of that on the website. If you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help. As always, just helping with the algorithms is a really big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, Rumble, the video version, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bells, liking the video. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, which are still the big ones, leaving a starred rating and a short review. And then finally, finally, if you're able to support on Patreon, that's always super, super appreciated. It's really what allows me to continue making these episodes. It's a subscription service. There's different tiers you can sign up for. You can sign up for even just $1 a month. Also, each of those tiers gives you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. There's always a lot of interesting bonus material that our guests share on there. So gives you a chance to give and also to receive something back. So that's it. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope, as always, this finds you all well, and I will see you all on the next episode.